a little controversial today, and I'm excited for it. Because today I wanted to talk about classical music, but a problem that's been known to plague the classical music world and those who inhabit it, and that is the idea of snobbery in the classical music community, if you will. And it's something that's very well known, and it's something that a lot of people talk about, and it's something that a lot of people really try to fight against. So is it a stigma? Is it accurate? Where does it come from? I really wanted to know the answer to this question. This is something I've been familiar with for a very long time, obviously. I have appreciated classical music since as long as I can remember, honestly. But along with that, I've known that people had a stigma against classical music. I didn't want to just tell people that I like classical music and I like listening to it, because I didn't want to be myself perceived as someone who is also snobbish and elitist. And this idea of it being an elitist genre of music still carried along when I went into college. A lot of professors talked about the problem, and several of them often talked with us, the students, about how to kind of fight back against that stigma and now to not make ourselves seem elitist towards other genres of music. But where did this come from exactly? Obviously, something like this isn't going to just come out of left field. It has to be a deep-rooted issue for the public at large to kind of view classical music enthusiasts in this light, right? Well, I decided to do the research and find the answers, and if you have the popcorn, I've got the salt. So let's get going into this. First, let's look at the history of this whole thing and go back long before this problem even really started. Classical music is usually defined separately from folk music or popular music, and is usually considered more of an artistic form of music, but the actual study of classical music as we know it didn't really come about until the Romantic era. Prior to that, the study of music really was limited to what's coming out now, what's modern now, what do we have from our contemporary composers that we can look at and study and create music from. But by the time the Romantic era really started setting in, musicians and composers really started to look to the past for the first time and trying to understand how music was written prior, and use that as a basis not only to kind of preserve what happened in the past, but also to kind of inform the contemporary music that was coming out and to kind of push new boundaries by looking backwards. You can see this in kind of the way that, for example, Beethoven was idolized. Beethoven was heavily idolized throughout the Romantic era. In fact, Beethoven's music and the boundaries that he pushed within the limits of classical music ended up becoming the foundations and basis for what later on became Romantic music. Another really big composer that we probably wouldn't even know as much about today if it had not been for the musicians of the Romantic era was Bach. Bach really came back in full force and was sort of idolized, not quite the same way that Beethoven was, but his music was sort of rediscovered and appreciated across the board by many, many, many musicians. And it's because of those musicians and composers and historians that we know as much about him today and appreciate him to the extent that we do today. So that's really where our idea of looking backwards at classical music sort of came from. It's obviously evolved since then. We know more about the classical era and the Baroque era, and then later on, we really started to dig into the medieval era and the Renaissance era. But obviously, if we're considering the idea of snobbishness and elitism in the study of classical music, it's gotta be more than just, well, we started learning about old composers, right? So what else really changed during this time? Because a lot of changes were going on in how people understood, appreciated, and listened to classical music as a whole. See, prior to this, when people would go and listen to a concert of classical music, It was often the upper classes of society, maybe some of the middle class, and very, very rarely would it ever be the lower class of people. And people would go to these events and they'd listen to these concerts and they'd listen to the musicians perform, but it was more of a social event than it was to sit there and listen to and appreciate the music like we often do today. Yes, people came dressed in their best like we have this stereotype of, but people came to socialize, not really listen to the music. The lights were left on, people would talk to each other. Sometimes you could even bring food and drink into the concert hall, which is almost unheard of in our modern day. But around the Romantic era again, we start to see changes in how people wanted to listen to classical music. For example, Wagner decided that in his operas he wanted to dim the lights in the audience so that your full attention could be brought to the stage and you'd have your full focus about everything that was going on. His whole idea of Gesamtkunstwerk is that everything that was going on is a piece of a bigger puzzle, and that everything on stage was the whole entire work and you had to take it all in order to appreciate all of it. Other things that we now practice also started popping up during this time. For example, not clapping between movements, not having a big roaring thunderous applause, keeping it pretty level and pretty quiet. And a lot of these customs can either be attributed to people like Wagner, where they wanted to change the rules and change the society and make the focus about the art and the music, or it can be attributed to a little bit of classism. You see, around this time, the Romantic era, you do have to remember what else is going on in history. The Industrial Revolution, a lot of countries are getting much wealthier than they were before, a lot more people are becoming wealthier than they were before, and there's this rise of the middle class. So sort of like a whole bunch of people who are now new money. So this middle class is coming up and rising up and wanting to be accepted as part of the upper classes. And the upper classes still want to differentiate themselves between themselves and the middle class. And so because of this, we start to see a lot more practices of, well, I'm going to behave much more polite, I'm going to behave much more refined when I go to things such as a concert. So clapping is down, the talk is down, we focus on the art. And that's where a lot of these more strict etiquette practices really start to pop up. But people still appreciated the music, they're still going to these concerts, and we don't really have this full idea of elitism really popping up yet. It's more coming from the middle class wanting to be accepted in the upper echelons of society than it is from the upper classes really turning their nose down and looking down upon the lower classes beneath them. So where do we see this whole idea of elitism really starting to take a turn for the worse? Well, after the Romantic era comes 20th century music, and in the 20th century we see a big rise in a lot of technology. For example, probably the biggest one to music in general is the idea of being able to record music and spread it out amongst the masses. This is really the first time that the average person can really access music and access almost any type of music that they really want to listen to. So no longer do you have to go to these big fancy concert halls, pay a bunch of money to go and dress up and act as if you're part of this uppity society. You can now buy yourself a record player and a record and listen to this kind of classical music at home. So now music is becoming more accessible, and now we don't need to really have these rules of, well, you need to act such and such way, or you need to do X, Y, and Z for etiquette. You can really just listen to it how you want to at home. But people are still going to concerts, and when we're going to concerts, we're still following those rules of society, right? And especially the more people that are getting exposed to classical music, the more we have this idea of people really need to learn how to appreciate this music. This idea sounds a little bit problematic at first, but it also sort of makes sense if you think about it with other genres of music. If you have a new genre that you just discovered and your friends are very unfamiliar with it and you want to introduce it to your friends, you probably are not going to start off with something heavy duty or hardcore, right? You want to ease them into it a little bit. You want to teach them in a way how to listen to the music that you really like. So this idea comes from a good-hearted place, right? If you want people to start to listen to classical music more, because classical music is becoming more accessible, you want them to know and understand the history of the music in general, right? But there's a few problems with this. So as I was doing research for this whole history of elitism, I ran across some essays from Virgil Thomson. So if you don't know who Virgil Thomson is, he was a pretty well-known composer and critic of classical music throughout the mid to late 20th century. And especially throughout like the 50s and 60s or so, he wrote a lot of essays about music, classical music, and music appreciation. Like I said, he was a critic, but he was a very salty one at that. And I had so much fun reading one of his essays titled The Appreciation Racket. I'll link it down in the description below because it is well worth a read. I wish I could just read off the whole thing here in this video, but it's gonna take way too long. You should definitely read the entire essay if you get a chance because it is full of salt, it is full of sass, and I am here for all of it. It is beautiful and it is amazing, and he really makes some good points too. Now, you may not agree with everything that he might have to say in this essay, but there are a few key points that I want to bring up in terms of talking about this history of elitism. Because in this essay, he really points out where this turning point is, where classical music just goes from, oh, we follow these proper rules and etiquettes, to we follow these proper rules and etiquettes because there's a little bit of an idea of I'm better than you. So in this essay, Virgil Thomson really talks a lot about this idea of music appreciation and how it's almost become a sub-study of music in a way. It's sort of like music history is a study of music, or ethnomusicology is a study of music. Music appreciation has become this branch of musical study. And he originally was writing this essay in the late 1960s. So this idea of music appreciation and its study had been around for quite some time. This also lines up with other contemporary composers of this era. For example, Leonard Bernstein had a very, very famous set of music appreciation classes that were televised for the general public to sit and watch through. Benjamin Britten, for another example, also wrote a big orchestral piece called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Things like this are coming out with the intention of teaching the general public how to understand classical music. Like I said before, the idea of well-intentioned, we want to show you how to appreciate the music that we love, but Virgil Thomson kind of points out in this essay that it starts to go a little bit too far. So he writes, unless he is already tied up with the pedagogical world, he usually refuses. If he makes his living as a teacher, refusal is difficult. I've seen many a private teacher forced out of business for refusing to cooperate with the publishers of appreciation books. Refusal of public school credits for private music study is the usual method of foreclosure. The racket muscles in on him. His name will be useful. His professional prestige will give a coloration of respectability to the shady business. He is offered a raise and some security in his job. He usually accepts. So with that, he's pointing out that a lot of times during this time period, many music teachers were kind of being pressured to write these music appreciation books. It was kind of this self-serving cycle, if you will, where music appreciation books were being written, people were reading them, people were demanding for more books, these publishers were pressuring music teachers to write more of these books, and so music teachers felt like they had to write more of these books in order to make any money or to not be pushed out of these circles of publishers and co-workers who were saying that you need to do this. He goes on to say, a certain limited repertory of pieces, 90% of them 100 years old, is assumed to contain most that the world has to offer of musical beauty and authority. The religious technique consists in a refusal to allow any questioning of any of them. Every psychological device is used to make the customer feel that musical non-consumption is sinful. As penance for his sins, he must, Number 1, buy a book. Number 2, buy a gramophone. Number 3, buy records for it. Number 4, buy a radio. Number 5, subscribe to the local orchestra if there is one. So here I really like how Thomson points this out as almost a religious experience, sort of kind of like going and confessing your sins. You know, oh, you're not a musical person? Well, you need to go and buy records and listen to them all day and listen to your local orchestra, and you need to atone for your sins because you've been bad and you don't listen to the proper types of music that you need to be listening to. And as I was reading throughout this whole essay, I really started understanding exactly what he was talking about. Because like I said, I've kind of felt that from other people before. This idea of you have to appreciate classical music. You have to understand classical music. You really need to understand it from this kind of perspective. It's not just you go, you listen to it, and you enjoy it, like it was during the actual classical era of music when people would just go and sit and listen to it and enjoy it as part of a social experience. It really was a kind of thing where you kind of felt sit down and strapped in and very prim and proper posture, and there was no relaxation about it. I can understand how it didn't really feel enjoyable, and it really did kind of feel that almost that stiff and strict, sort of like how people view, say, like a Catholic Mass sometimes if you yourself are not Catholic. But there was one quote in particular that really stood out to me in this essay and really resonated with me personally. If you will look at almost any of the appreciation books, you will notice that the music discussed is nearly all symphonic. Chamber music, except string quartets, and the opera are equally neglected. That the examples quoted are virtually the same in all the books, that they are quoted from a small number of musical authors, that 90% of them were written between 1775 and 1875 and are called symphony number something or other. All this means that by tacit agreement, music is defined as the instrumental music of the Romantic era, predominantly symphonic and predominantly introspective. At least that repertory contains a larger amount of the best music than any other. And that quote really stuck out to me because I myself am not a predominantly instrumental musician, just like my education and degree was not in instrumental education. I do play piano, but that is different than what most people consider when they think of classical music. His quote was really spot on for me. A lot of times when we think of classical music, we think of symphonic music. Now, he says something about the opera not being as strongly appreciated, and I feel like that has changed a little bit more in our modern times, but it really is limited to symphonic music, string chamber music, and a little bit of opera. Go to your local Barnes & Noble or anywhere else where you will buy records. That's the kind of stuff you'll find. You don't find a lot of anything else outside of that. And I feel this especially as someone who really appreciates choral music. I have a really hard time finding any good recordings and any good performances of choral music. You can find a lot of Beethoven's big symphonic works, but where are you going to find, for example, Brahms's Liebesliederwalzen? Like, you don't see that. You don't see recordings of that in record stores. You don't see CDs made of that kind of stuff. I can find it on Spotify nowadays because you can find almost anything on Spotify. But if I were to go to my local music store to try to find something physical to pick up and listen to, it's not gonna be a lot of piano music, a lot of solo instrumental music, a lot of vocal music outside of, say, the opera, a lot of choral music. It's just gonna be kind of what he talked about. Mostly all symphonic music that has the title of symphony, what did he say? Symphony number something or other. And I just wanted to read one more quote from his essay that I thought was a really good point to kind of leave his essay on. And he says, "Do not confuse the appreciation racket with the practice of musical analysis or the exposition of musical history. These are legitimate matters for both students and teachers to be occupied with. I am talking about a real racket that any American can recognize when I describe it. It is a fake, ecstatic, holier-than-thou thing." So here's where he really names it. It is that kind of elitism. And Virgil Thomson is attributing it to the idea of music appreciation. Now, like I said earlier with my little analysis that I went through, I don't think it started with music appreciation. I think it really did start with the idea of we have to make this proper, we have to go about it in a very strict kind of way, and then with the accessibility of records and having the option to either go to the stringent opera or the stringent symphony, or just picking up a record at home, that started to create a little bit of a barrier between people who regularly listen to classical music and people who maybe want to do it more casually. I really like it how James Parakilis puts it in his article, Classical Music as Popular Music. Classical music is no longer a ritual which you must dress up and travel to a public building to hear. Now it comes out of your speakers and into your ears before you know what it is, sometimes before you are awake. Now, the less hard you listen, the easier classical music is to like. The promoters of classical music rely on this new ease in making their product light. At the same time, they rely on its continued snob appeal. They work to build a larger and larger base of brand loyalty to it, but they cultivate that loyalty with elitist appeals. Strike a blow for civilization, read recent ads for Metropolitan Opera subscription. The Met uses the word civilization because Radio City and Madison Square Garden can't. The Met gets away with it, and thousands of other classical music organizations derive growth from elitist appeals because of economic and social changes. And that, I feel like, really sums up this whole idea. Is classical music didn't always used to be this stringent and strict, but over time we've kind of put these restrictions on it. And by doing that, we end up pushing away some people who would otherwise want to be interested and like to listen to it. Classical music, even without its etiquette restrictions, still has a really difficult barrier to entry. There's so much stuff, where do you even begin to start listening to? And this is not unique to classical music, but because of the history of it, the history of the classism, the history of, well, we have to teach people how to appreciate it, the history of, well, everybody has to appreciate it in a certain way, and we have to teach these classes on music appreciation and put it out to the masses so that they know how to understand classical music. It all has just slowly devolved into this idea of snobbishness and elitism. In the end, it's just really sad because it's sort of created this idea of, well, I'm not like other musical listeners, I listen to classical music. I'm a part of the cool kids club, or maybe the not so cool kids club, because I listen to classical music and you listen to basic pop music. And that's obviously a lot of us who listen to classical music don't want to promote and don't want to put out there. In fact, there are hundreds upon hundreds of forum threads asking what is up with this idea of elitism. How do we fight against this idea of elitism? What causes this snobbishness in classical music societies and classical music circles? And what can we do to fight against this? And where is this coming from? And I always had this idea until I really started listening to it, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of people, I feel like, really do want to fight against this. There's always going to be somebody who's genuinely going to think that they're better than you because they listen to whatever genre they listen to. But classical music, I feel, is really unique in the sense that it has to start with that uphill battle if you want to get anybody new listening to your music. So how do we really do that? Well, I honestly think the best way for most of us who currently exist in that circle to really think back about what made you start to want to listen to that music. For me, personally, it's been a thing where I've really always kind of liked the idea of classical music. I remember when I was really little, I had one of those leap pad books. Do you remember those? It was that big, thick, plastic book thing that you would then insert another book into. And I had one that was about classical music composers. And that's really where I first got exposed to this idea of classical music. I could take that little pen that was in the book and I could tap the different composers and listen to their songs. And sometimes I just lay that on the floor and play the different composers and just listen to it for fun more than anything else. Nobody else in my family really listened to classical music outside of, I don't know, maybe doing it every now and then. I was the only one who really seemed to enjoy it, and I came to it on my own accord. And obviously my tastes have changed since I was little. I used to really like Baroque music, especially keyboard Baroque music. Less so now, but I've really gotten into Renaissance music and Impressionism and 20th century music and romantic music and all different kinds of genres. And I think if we as musicians and classical music lovers think back to what made us listen to these genres in the first place, I think that will help inform us how to share it better with others. We've got to remember that a lot of people who might be listening to classical music for the first time have that view against classical music and really don't know where to start. And sometimes it's not a matter of completely winning people over, but more so just trying to get people to realize that it's not as bad as what you might think it is. I think, for example, about my husband. My husband has gone to many of my concerts throughout our whole entire relationship. We started dating back in high school, so he even went to some of my high school concerts as well as a good chunk of my college concerts too. And he always went with the intention of going to support me. He didn't really like the music that I always sung and I always performed and I always did. But it wasn't really until I got into college and really started doing some beautiful pieces of music that he realized that classical music isn't always what he thought it was. Now, he's never gonna go sit down and listen to any kind of classical music, anything. He's a Daft Punk and EDM fan at heart. But when he listened to my concerts of Renaissance music or modern choral music, and we would do those things where, you know, the choir stands in the aisles of the audience and sings to the audience, it was moments like that when he started to go, you know, I didn't hate that piece. And that went into, you know, I actually kind of like that piece. And I think for us in the classical music community, if we can just get that, that will be enough. So with that, I think that's where we should go forward. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you think about this and how you maybe plan on sharing classical music with those who might be more opposed to it or have the wrong impressions of it. Have you seen this kind of elitism, or have you mostly experienced people who are just trying to fight against the stigma? Let me know. And with that, I will see you next time. Goodbye. I think it's good enough. Good enough. Ow, wow. Good enough. Bow, wow. That's a little bit better. Okay. I really like it how James Parkulis put it in classical music